Looking to break into or advance your career in cybercrime and cybersecurity? Apply now with a master's degree of cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advance justice for victims. Designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that can work around your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more.
Welcome, everybody, to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. I'm Tom Holt. I'm a professor in the School of Criminal Justice here at Michigan State University. I'm also the director for the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training. And I'm here with my co-host, as always.
I'm Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and an associate with the center here at Michigan State University.
And today we have an excellent guest with us who I've known for, probably a decade now.
Almost, I know. Just thinking about that the other day, I was like, wow, it's been almost 10 years.
I know, it's crazy. Time really flies. Well, Jesse, since you've jumped in, I'll let you introduce yourself, actually.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me, Tom, Rachel. My name's Jesse Cale. I'm an associate professor of criminology in the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, at Griffith University in Australia. And I'm also the deputy director of research for the Griffith Youth Forensic Service, which is a service that's actually the 25-year anniversary this year of the service. And it's a unique service because it's a service that provides treatment for young people so kids, adolescents under the age of 18 who commit sexual offenses that are referred to us through the Department of Youth Justice. And so we have, it's a sort of a specialized treatment program that's connected to the university. So it's like a partnership with the Department of Youth Justice and the university, which is what it definitely makes it unique in Australia. I suspect there may be things like that probably in the US a bit, but here it's quite unique. Here, usually services like that are just government run or NGOs. And so, yeah, and I came here in 2010 after I finished my PhD at SFU to do a postdoc with the clinic. And then I left after I had a 3-year postdoc. And then I worked at the University of New South Wales for a few years. Have come back to Griffith just before COVID, so the timing was pretty good. And then just stepped back into a role now in a more senior role at the clinic. So it was really cool to kind of be there as kind of a student / postdoc, and then in a research capacity, and now sort of being deputy director of research and able to kind of make decisions about research and stuff like that. So yeah.
So how did you get interested in studying sexual offending?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I mean, it's a fair one. And I think the answer is like kind of unremarkable insofar as like I did my grad school at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and for my master's degree, I was working with Ray Corrado on like issue terrorism, I think it was. So I started grad school on 9/11. That was my first day of grad school. And I remember, I woke up in my residence and turned on the news, and I was like, and the night before, I was with a guy I just met who's a really close friend now, Jonathan Haidt, and he was from the States. And we were just having this debate, being Canadian and being American. Again, we're like in our 20s, right? And I was talking about, the problem with your country is he's like, well, the problem with your country is, then the next day I'm like, dude, I'm so sorry. It's like, it was a weird time. And so I did, and that kind of sparked me at that time. I was very general in my interest, and I was like, and then 9/11 happened. And so there's a professor there, Ray Corrado, who's retired now. And, he was sort of the guy who did terrorism research. And so I did my master's degree on that. And then for the PhD, I met a young sort of assistant professor who just started working there by the name of Patrick Lucier. And we kind of became friends. And he was probably 5 years older than I was at the time. Well, I was still, obviously, but, and that was his area. And we just kind of started talking. He's a really interesting guy, a brilliant guy. And I was just like, wow, we really don't know a lot about this. Like, it was really a topic where I think people had preconceived notions about, well, and clearly, what a sex offender, quote unquote, looks like. and we kind of go out and just have discussions, and then I said, hey, look, this is really interesting, and seems like there's a lot of work to be done here. And so and we just kind of started, it kind of unfolded from there. So it wasn't for like any, deep-seated kind of motivation to there's a lot of people in the field I find now, and look, I think it's, I don't know, for better or worse in some ways, where are getting into there's sort of the advocacy side of what we do in research, and I'm much more on the kind of, look, here's the evidence side. I don't and look, I think there's benefit to both. I'm not the former, and I think I do see particularly students these days often getting involved in this kind of thing because of personal things that may have happened to them or someone they know, and not just in sex offending, but I had a colleague, who lived through some of the early some of the conflicts in Europe in the 1990s, trying to be specific, and so and was from one of these countries where there was civil war, and was doing a PhD in there, and had a lot of trouble, and eventually didn't finish because he couldn't get around sort of his view of the version of things that happened, right or wrong or what it was. We know it's not really that simple. And so it's a good analogy in the sense that it wasn't anything that a victimization or anything necessarily that directly happened to him, sort of, but I have students quite often coming to me and saying, hey, I want to study this because XYZ happened to me, and I'm like, look, like, this isn't a good this could be fraught to kind of go down this road, as opposed to sort of getting, I think whether something else you need, like whether it's therapy or something. I try and emphasize to students, doing a PhD on something like this isn't therapy. And I feel like over the years, I mean, it's been a little bit of time now that that I'm seeing a bit more of that. And because, I mean, I suspect it would be kind of hard to stay objective, from a scientific point of view, when that happens. Now, having said that, I don't think that that's necessarily, I think there could be some value, definitely on the advocacy side. In Australia, a lot of the research in this space is advocacy driven, which is good from an advocacy point of view and a victim point of view, victim survivor point of view, and those sort of things. But that can lend to, I think, kind of echo chambers, and basically, you can't say anything wrong, right? If you're saying things to support victims, which is, it's not about saying things wrong, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it can be it's a slippery kind of slope. So there's some really great advocacy research out there, don't get me wrong, but there's also, like anything else, I think. So anyways, the short answer to your question is, there wasn't really any good particular reason that kind of got me onto this topic, besides the fact that I met a really interesting supervisor that showed me that, look, we need to understand this better than we think we do, and the idea being, we think that there was this, it's psychological, like, it's the ideas, the early ideas we have, like sexual psychopaths, and there, and the myths around there. So we had a book that came out in 2010, and it was literally called An Evidence Response to Myths and Misconceptions About Sex Offending, which was kind of a summary of, it was myself, Patrick, and Evan McCush, who's at SFU now, it was really kind of all of our research up for collectively for the last 15 or 20 years at that point, put together, and so that was really fun kind of exercise. So yeah.
Talking about the advocacy piece, right? Ideally, we have these 4 parts of a machine that work together, being policy, research, advocacy, and practice. And those don't tend to merge together as well as they should. But they also have very specific ways that they work, and it's hard to be an expert in all 4.
Yeah, no, 100%. And like, there's a couple scholars in Australia that are really quite like out there in the media, advocacy focused, that are actually really great. They do actually, I think, quite good quality research. the thing that I find that's always tricky about that is sort of this thing where it's like you're out to prove a point, which you'll find whatever evidence you need to do that. It's kind of like when we have law students, they have a lot of problems in research methods. We have a dual degree. It's because they're taught to think a different way, right? You're taught to kind of, search out evidence to support your point, whereas science is kind of the opposite, right? And then as far as those other two, I mean, it's basically like government silos. You know what I mean? Like they don't.
Yeah.
I know it totally research policy making. We have a government as is everywhere right now that's going on and banging a drum, a state government banging the drum about youth crime on the rise. And look, my house, about 3 weeks ago, some kids tried to break into my house at night, and it's on camera and stuff. And I mean, look, at the time, I'll be fair, it was freaky to wake up at 3 a.m, get the adrenaline going. But they just go and try the front doors. And amazingly enough, the Gold Coast is, it's only 500,000 people, and people still think it's the 80s here. And they leave their doors unlocked at night, which is why kids go around and try and open the doors. And when they can't open them, they go to the next one. It's like classic SCP. And and so, but that gets to people, and it got to me too. Like I have a 5 and a 7-year-old, so I was a bit, but we have this government who, in the face of like any statistics you show, we have had so many academics from our school going onto the media and showing graphs, here's the youth crime trend, here's this and that. It's like, youth crime's out of control, we're going to bring in adult time for adult crime, and it's like, what's adult crime, compared to youth? So it's really disheartening. Like I hear I saying that, I've always struggled with that, because I'm like, you're right, you publish a study, it's based on evidence, and then the policy is just sort of the opposite. And sometimes I guess you hit the mark, and you gotta, I haven't worked my head around that one.
Crime is something I think rests a lot in people's feelings when they talk about it, right? If they feel unsafe, the fact that statistically it's less likely doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the myths come in too, especially about sexual offending.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, it's hard now for me when it comes to sexual offending, because like I have a very, because of the knowledge, that we all have on our topics, to take yourself out of that and really think to people how people are still perceiving an issue, whether it's youth crime, after you've studied it for, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, like it's hard to be like, and you get disconnected from what people are thinking. And I think that's a lot of the critique of academics and stuff like that you hear. It always has been, but it's hard to kind of take yourself out of that, right? And so so when I have a very different view, having read so many case files, I haven't done a lot of interviewing in the past, but I have done interviews with young people. Well, I've done interviews with young people in prison in Canada. I actually was able to do some interviews with men in a prison in Europe. It was kind of as an undergrad though, who were convicted of sex offenses, which was interesting. It was for a project, this tour we did in Europe. And right now I'm doing, I've read through just probably thousands of the case files now and stuff. So you're taking kind of that and understanding the background of all these people, and then sort of how they've done what they've done. And there is the small component that probably fit that narrative of like the guy hiding behind the bush waiting to rape people, but most people think that's the whole population, right? When in fact it's like 2 to 3. If you talk about sort of things like sexually sadistic sex crimes and sexual homicide, things like that, you're in single digits percentage in terms of prevalence relative to the population of individuals convicted for sexual crimes. One of the best sort of things that I ever sort of read that was written about it, that is a good way to frame it, was with the professor I came to do my postdoc with, Stephen Smallbone, who was the founder of the clinic. And in one of the chapters we wrote, he had this line in it, and he was kind of like, the thing to like, how to go, it was like, there's really 95% of the time what happens in sexual offenses is quite unremarkable from a sexual point of view, and it's like the issue of context and consent that it happens. So whereas the idea people have is I mean, it's out of Hollywood and those movies like those there's all kinds of movies and stuff like that. So it's definitely like a huge disconnect. So that gets tricky when you're navigating. We're really careful around media we do at GIFTS, and they've been quite averse to, particularly also because they're kids. So you want to kind of like be a bit careful with sort of the stigmatization they have on them and stuff like that. But yeah.
So is it fair to say then that you come with a very offender-informed perspective, or how would you describe kind of your approach to the topic?
Yeah, I think so. I think more of an individual, sort of like my background theoretically is quite heavily, I would argue, in developmental life course criminology. And so a lot of the research has been understanding sort of how, individuals, understanding sort of individual level. But I think still I should be careful because like I teach a theory course now too. I just developed a really cool theory course. I was so proud of it. Just because we have like this budgetary constraints, so we're starting to be like having to be creative with how we deliver classes and stuff. And they took away. We had separate theory classes, and now they're just like you have to put it into one. So I have to go from biosocial criminology to postmodernism in 12 weeks, right? so yeah, it was a challenge, but it was a really cool experience at the same time. And I think, look, Australia historically, whether it's in this space of that we're talking about in terms of sexual offending specifically, or even more broadly, has been much more characterized by the cultural level explanations, sociocultural kind of theory, stuff like that. And there's all kinds of reasons for that historically, but the being immersed in that environment, we find, my wife and I both, and other North Americans I work with who find that you're oftentimes kind of siloed because you're using individual level explanations. But I'm really kind of do feel like we're starting to better integrate do the sort of theoretical cross-level integration. So it's like, well, how, and a lot of that comes out of, the research on the impacts of colonialism and stuff like that on individual factors, on, intergenerational trauma, which is shown now to have, you could, sort of epigenetic effects and stuff. So, I mean, I think now data is another issue when it comes to kind of operationalizing different levels of theory like that. But I like to think, that I'm more of a integrated, take more of an integrated approach, and I consider that sort of developmental life course, but definitely offender focused in the sense of, once you getting into the backgrounds of these individuals and sort of trying to map out like why it is that they've done what they've done, right?
One of the areas I know you've worked in, and I'm curious to hear how this kind of dovetails with your work with the center, is the dark web, and how you kind of see the dark web in the broader picture of sexual offending.
So I have a confession kind of to make. So like, when I was talking about my grad school a little while ago, and this was 2001 when I started, like I was the tech guy, okay? Like I was the one running around fixing profs' computers when they couldn't figure out what happened to my IP address. And then like 2005 hit, right? And that was Facebook and iPhone and all that. And then and like the curve, as we all know, just went like that, right? And then that was in the middle, and I was doing my PhD and stuff. And like at this stage, I'm pretty much like one of those professors. Like I'm a Luddite. I'm like, when it comes to, like, I listened to Tom. I remember when you're in Australia and you're doing a presentation at Department of Education we were at, and I was like, what's all this things that he's talking about? Like what's a Discord, and stuff like that. And I was like, man, like honestly, so like I get the dark web for sure. But it's starting to feature into the reason why I kind of wanted to talk about sort of the CSAM stuff in the context of young people was because you've seen it. We have 25 years of data, so I've actually seen it change over time, what that looks like. And now you're starting to see the sophistication around people using going into the dark web and using sort of those channels. But interestingly, there was some work done by Richard Wortley in the last few years. It was a few years ago. I think it was in Sydney. I saw him do a presentation. It was like, so the dark web obviously offering protection and sort of anonymity and all that. But he was saying, like, he interviewed, I don't know, it was maybe 100, adults, for CSAM offenses. So when I say CSAM, should I clarify the child sexual abuse material offenses? And he's like, and most of them don't even bother. Like, they're just like, they don't even use, the service for what reasons, there's probably different ones, but we're definitely, the interesting thing though, is that looking at sort of our files over the years is now you're starting to see that a bit. You're starting to see a level of sophistication that you didn't, 15 years ago, I think is when I found the first case around 2009 or something like that where there were actual charges of child exploitation material in the file. And the other thing, that came out of some of the research that we did was that again, because I don't know a lot about the tech side of stuff. I'm reading through some of these clinical files actually just the other day, and I was like, some of the kids are using apps. I forget the name of it, but it's Kick or something on it. And it was, is that because they don't need to really anything to register for it? So like, I'm learning this stuff just now, right? Like the tech side of this, I'm learning. But what shocked me about that other research that we were involved with was just the sheer volume, but how in a way, like there's so much stuff on the open web that it's like, you're kind of like hedging, you're probably not going to get caught even putting stuff out on the open web because it's just such a, the sheer volume of it and stuff like that. So I have to be honest, like a limited insight, at least in terms of how this demographic of young people are engaging with the dark web. And so this is the reason I'm putting in a grant next year, right? Because I want to kind of get, understand it a bit better. But the one thing I can say is you have seen sort of a level of sophistication increase in terms of how this population, I presume, others as well, are using the dark web to sort of access and trade material and things like that. So but it's going to be a tricky one.
Yeah. So I want to underline, I think this is a good example of something we always say, right? Where forms of crime that are taking place online, it doesn't mean you have to be a tech wizard. There's a lot of behavioral things to understand that are important.
I'm so happy you said that, because I definitely agree with you there. And because I was kind of coming into this, I'm like, I can talk a lot about that stuff, but like, I hope they don't ask me a lot of tech questions because like, I'm not too sure what's going on here, But yeah, there definitely is that side of it, because one of the things that you get, and I'd love to kind of tell you eventually about sort of the pattern that at least I'm seeing from the qualitative data over 25 years. But one of the things, like these questions pop in your head and you hear about these things that kids are doing. And I've always said, of all the sort of files we've worked with, whether it was forensic psychiatric files in Canada with the kids in prison or here at GIFS, you read these files, and whether tech is involved or not, you're kind of like where was the family, where were the parents, and that sort of thing. None of these. Oftentimes, I have students say, people often say, how could a kid do something so like violent or quite serious and stuff like that? And like when you read these files, which are basically like history, their entire histories, medical, psychiatric, whatever, legal, you're like, man, it was more of a question of when, not like why or just or not how they could do that sort of thing, right? They're like roadmaps, and it's quite tragic. And now there's the tech element to it, right? So that we're, and again, that was sort of the subject of some of the other research that we've done, where a lot of the theory and a lot of things that we understand about juvenile delinquency or whatever you want to call it, is based in the real world, and that's shifted now to kind of behaviors online. And the question is, again, then the question becomes, when are we talking about obviously tech facilitated stuff versus like what would you call it? New essentially new crimes that we didn't have before. There was the tech stuff, and I mean, we always had, for example, CEM, but in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you had these really small networks of individuals that were sharing hard copy material in really, kind of what I would argue are creative ways to get around being caught. But man, since you've had with the anonymity that comes with the internet, that the sheer numbers are they're astronomical, right? So getting that content somehow out of there, I think is an important, as much as, so you're, and kind of going around and coming back around to your point, is as much as it's important to understand the behavioral side, which is definitely from a prevention point of view. I think that we have to get tech that's gonna kind of get in there and sort of just eradicate some of this data. And then this is me and my very Luddite kind of, but with, the things we're seeing now with AI, like I'm not unconvinced. And I don't know, Tom, have you seen Rusty Brewer, who's a colleague of ours at University of Adelaide? He started doing some work with AI with a group of people a couple of years ago. I think it was a couple of years ago, looking at using AI to detect, to go through like volumes and volumes of CEM or material, and identify patterns in voices and visual recognition, stuff like that. And I think he's just gotten another project that's actually looking at a bit. To be fair, I have to look into it in a bit more detail, but I just remember kind of seeing something about it and using AI to kind of get at that material and essentially sort of eradicate. So I think there is a tech to some extent, because the problem is exploded sort of so exponentially. I think there is a role that tech is going to kind of play to addressing the problem. But there's definitely, on the behavioral side, like there's a lot that we can talk about even today. So, yeah.
So from your perspective, with the files that you see and the youth you work with, what would you say are the most significant predictors? You say there's kind of a pathway, there's things that you would note. What would you argue are the most important factors that you see?
Yeah, it's well, to be honest, I think it's, again, you're reading through these files and you're like, these kids are doing what? And with, with whatever tech they're doing that ties into what we're talking about. But you're like, where are their parents? Like, I mean, I was like, how are you 13 and accessing the dark web, for example? And things like that. So I think, and sort of, Rachel, going back to your point, it's I think we're losing that. Like, I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm like, if you look back to sort of the last half century of crim theory, a lot of it was focused on the family, like social control through social bonding and things like that. And that obviously, especially that came out of North America and everything else, a lot of it. And now we're just moving away from that. And as a parent as well now, so a 5 and 7 year old, and having to interact against my will with other parents, and sort of, and you're like, but you're like, and there's an idea there though. It's a good kind of qualitative sort of study. But there's definitely an idea, at least here and among sort of, the people that we know, that there's like that hey, kids will just figure it out. You don't really need to parent them. They're just little adults, like we used to think before the Juvenile Delinquency Act type of thing, like short of working in mines. We're like, hey, they're just like mini me's. Like they can feed themselves. They can, they'll work it out. And like I do feel that there is this laissez-faire and it's a parenting style that is, at least where I am, it's very pervasive. And so then it becomes less difficult to kind of understand where the parents are, because they're kind of doing their own thing and figure that the kids are doing the same and kind of reason the way they do, I guess. Like that's my best guess. And now luckily, obviously not, but in the context that I'm talking about, in terms of, my children and our circles that we're in or whatever, that's nothing, severe and really, but you do see the impacts of it. Kids are a bit, less regulated and stuff like that because there's no routine. Who likes routine? That's not cool. But kids need routine. I mean, the child development literature is pretty clear. And so now bring that into what we're talking about, and you're like, okay, well, you're starting to kind of see the first pieces of the puzzle kind of come together. But I think the interesting thing, Tom, kind of about your question is that like we don't really have a good understanding yet of why some kids are kind of getting involved in CSAM stuff and some are not. And the reason it's a really important question that I think is a blind spot right now, because it's not a simple one insofar as, so there's CSAM material. So that's material involving kids, under the age of 18 or whatever. Now we're talking about kids the same age, right? So some of them are engaging, producing material, which we'll get into. I can talk about different sort of intent and motivations for that, of kids the same age. And then there's some that are kind of engaging with material with children. So like developmentally inappropriate kind of material, right? And so you have this dimension there. So that means if young people are involved, and so I'll jump into it. Like this gets back into the early cases we saw, and this draws into the legal arena some issues too, where you have kids in 2010. So remember the time, this is when I remember I had a BlackBerry in 2010 when I came to Australia. And so keeping in mind, we don't have the phones we have now and all that, right? But you had kids that we've seen at the clinic for, whatever it might have been, kind of a sexual offense, inappropriate touching, or all the way up to sexual assault, whatever it was. And one of them had a phone, and so took a picture. And that picture might have been to show their friends, or a picture might have been just for them to have, to kind of say, remind them of what they've done or whatever. They get caught and they've been hammered with child exploitation material offenses. Now, I would argue so if you're talking about intent motivation, the intent to produce and distribute CEM material. I'm jumping back between CEM and CSAM, so I hope that's okay. But the intent's not there to produce it or distribute it, to produce it, but you know what I'm saying? Like they're not like, hey, I'm gonna kind of build a volume, or they're showing their friends and they're taking pics of themselves and sending them inappropriately to other people. And in early days, at least here, we're seeing that was being labeled as CEM offenses. Those were the charges kids were getting, right? And then you start kind of, as the years go by, you start seeing a bit of different things emerge where it's becoming more frequent. So you're getting, by 2013 now, you're getting more of that happening, whether it's group offenses, so groups of we're talking about 99% male perpetrators here. So groups of young boys, who are assaulting girls and sort of recording it, for example. So the next thing that happens that I see in sort of the pattern is that then some of that stuff starts getting out into the wild, right? And that's where you're seeing CM offenses again and stuff. And so that kind of changed after, with the proliferation of a lot of the social networking and social media. So then you're starting to see this pattern kind of emerge. Then when you get to sort of more recent time, then you see kids, you see some kids that, and now this goes into sort of some differences we may be seeing in terms of your question, like what are, differentiate some kids who are just kind of coming across. There's a lot of interesting cases where kids are, because of the way the internet, I don't know if it's the way algorithms work maybe, on things on sites like Pornhub or whatever sites there are, that kids kind of start going down these rabbit holes. Because again, they're being unsupervised. Like, so again, how your kid is accessing, like, at least I have contingency plans in place for my kids when it comes to the internet and how they're going to be engaging with it. But you see some of these kids where kids just go down these weird rabbit holes, and all of a sudden they're finding this stuff, and it's like, it's sort of like that train wreck thing. You can't, and then you're like, hey, I'm going to look again. I'm going to look again. And so, so again, I'm kind of hypothesizing a bit, but it's like, to what extent does that result in developing potential preferences for this type of content, and whatever the content might be? That we don't need to get into details, obviously, but whether it might be age inappropriate content, or whether it's quite like violent sort of content in the context of what we're talking about. So I'm not too sure. And in a lot of those cases, and then no other criminal convictions or issues. You're not actually talking about antisocial kids, right? That was some of the early research I did with gifts, and going back to the rounding to the very beginning, what we're talking about was like the idea that, these are all kind of what we'd consider life course persistent, really serious, violent kids who commit sex offenses. That's actually the minority of the population. The majority of kids in the study that I did with data from the clinic to 2010, 60% had no other offenses in their background. Right. And so, but had committed a sexual offense, and these are more often against children and younger people. When you start getting into sort of the more violent offenses against peer age and adults, that's where you see that LCP kind of pattern, violent and all that kind of stuff, right? But in the cases of CSAM, that some of these ones that I'm talking about, like, there's no indication. There's not even necessarily mental health issues. And in a lot of the cases, you're just like, wow, like this, they just, they kind of describe just coming across content and keep engaging with it, and kind of getting worse and worse. And there's studies on that too. Like Michael Cito, who's a leader in sort of the sexual abuse field, he's done some work to show, I think, that there's this, there's evidence there that some people there's this escalation in the type of content people engage with once they, not everyone, but there's some evidence of that kind of a pattern being there. In terms of getting sort of into more severe content, the more, and I think that's general there's some research that generally shows that for pornography as well, if I'm not mistaken, but yeah, so then there's those, so there's this is, and why I think like, one of the things I go back to, and going back to your point, Rachel, and I had it written down some of my notes yesterday, was reading a case and sort of, it was sort of one of these contexts. And one of the things that came up was sort of this lack of attachment to any peers, sort of lonely. So, loneliness, lack of attachment to peers, sort of not a very supportive family environment, and left to their own devices, and an open internet. And the other important thing I think to remember is that this is the other reason I think this is really a blind spot, is because these are the formative years of sexuality, right? So of sexual preference and things like that. Just I don't want to get into that debate around, but a lot of things that happen in adolescence form the basis for kind of sexuality and how it's expressed, I should say, from sort of a social learning perspective, I would argue. And so when regardless of preferences, so if that's the only content you're engaging with during this sort of crucial developmental period, that has huge implications for the people who are doing it that we've kind of studied as we're adults. What was happening at this stage in life. So there's a lot of potential for preventative aspect to this, I think, and particularly from Rachel, the side that you're talking about. But I mean, and that would apply, I would argue, not just to CSAM, but like to everything. I mean, as we know. So, look, the other side of it is then this, I would call kind of the not manosphere effect, but this Andrew Tate kind of effect, or this really interesting kind of I should say interesting, but like almost sort of a subculture around porn and around making porn and stuff like that. So it's like, these aren't just people who are committing offenses and recording them, but there's sort of this elaborate kind of either often group types of offenses, and almost mirrors kind of like pornography production. And in the discussions they have, and I don't know how much of that is tied to this. Like what I said, I call it know if that's an accurate way to frame it, but I don't know if I'm being clear. But it's sort of like that subculture around pornography, but it's because of the age of the people we're talking about. It's basically CSAM stuff, right? So they're basically generating, and then child sexual abuse material, and then again getting out into the internet and stuff like that. And then finally, I would say from what I've seen so far, then there's just the other end of the spectrum where you have young people who are producing child pornography. Again, not common cases, but running distribution networks on the dark web. And things like that. So just from there, like you can see the heterogeneity in what these things look like in this demographic, and I think that kind of probably each one of those requires different sort of approaches to really kind of try and circumvent. But look, that's kind of the reason. I was just a week or two ago, I was like, we've got to put in a grant for this, because I was like, there's not a lot of literature on it. I don't think it's well understood. We know a lot more about the adult side of things and the policing side of stuff and the tech side as well. I think the leaps being made there I mean, just in general, this is going to be an interesting time for all of us, right? And I think I do believe a lot of good is going to come out of it, and I hope it does, especially in the context of what we're talking about. But I think, in terms of sort of this demographic, it is, there's a lot of implications for kind of understanding it a bit better, I think. So.
I would imagine the normalization plays a large part, because when you're talking about the progression, as you said, there's research on kind of this rabbit hole that CSAM offenders who don't necessarily have strictly pedophilic tendencies show in their behavior, right? They start with something kind of taboo, it doesn't satisfy them anymore, and then they continue to look at worse forms. And then you have CSAM consumers who people say, I would have never guessed this guy. It's like, well, yeah, because it's not manifesting in other ways. Yeah. It's this kind of pornography related behavior. And as a non-parent, I try to reserve judgment as much as possible. But the more we learn, the more horrified I am at how many people are just letting their kids with no constraints access the internet for whatever purpose they want.
Oh no, it's shocking. No, it's shocking, and that's because we hear things, we're like, oh yes, we let our kids do so and so, and we're like, what? Like I'm right now, so we're in school break right now with the kids, and they have all kinds of activities, and next week's code camps, or what's called code camp for our partner, for our 7-year-old, and they're doing Roblox, and so I'm like, okay, so then I was like, you're doing Roblox? And I'm like, what's a Roblox? And so then I got to start doing research. And so I'm getting into it now, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm starting to get to see the problem here. So it's interesting. We're talking to one of the parents, though, and he's like, yeah, he goes, look, I let my kids play Roblox, but I monitor it very carefully. And he actually, it was funny, and he was going on, and he's like, I actually set up a profile and tried to join their group. And they're like, get the hell out of here. So he's all happy, right? He's like, okay, my kids are, and going to what you're saying, Rachel's like, who, and so here's a good example of someone, like, he kind of tested out his kids. He's like, okay, they're cool. They kind of get it. They're not going to be, let people into their groups and stuff like that. But yeah, it is shocking. But then on the flip side of that, where people, and I think a lot of it just has to do with, again, it's like arguably people like me who don't understand a lot of what can be done and what kids can get into, but aren't trying to understand it either. Where as soon as I hear, like I'm doing research on Roblox now because I need to understand it so that I can decide how, kids can engage with it safely. Because from what I hear, they're not going to not engage with it. You know what I mean? And you can't. And so, but then you hear about, parents who just give free reign. Like, and the other dimension of that is just, like putting kids on iPads for 8 hours or whatever. I mean, that's a whole other issue. So there's the issue of what that does neurologically, and then there's also the issue of what they're looking at. So I mean, parents need to understand what their kids are getting into. And look, to be totally fair, it's a lot for parents, I think, to have that. Like, it's a lot to parent under the best of circumstances, let alone, and then getting across this stuff and everything else that comes along. So, but yeah, no, it's absolutely shocking. What kind of, and I think again, it's more to do with the lack of understanding of what is out there and how easy it is to access. I wonder how much of it's a generational thing too, because of this, the time that we're all in, the relative age of all of us. Whereas like once this stuff becomes more normalized, in 50 and however many years, it's going to be people will have that better understanding, you know what I'm saying, right? So it's a kind of a bit of a tricky time, I think, all around when you're navigating this stuff for sure.
I think something that needs to be emphasized more, though, I'm sorry if I interrupted you, is that the explanation for why things like Roblox are popping up as problematic spaces is actually pretty simple. It's something that parents ask about a lot because they hear about it, but there's nothing technologically about Roblox that makes it easier for child predators, to use that term broadly. It's that people who want to try and talk to kids are going to go where kids are. It's a pure opportunity routine activities explanation. And so, we're not talking about encrypted messaging. It's just that there are kids on Roblox, so people go to Roblox to talk to kids.
Yeah, 100%. Just like it used to be the park, right? Like in the 80s, I mean, I remember being a kid in the 80s. I must have been, I was walking home from school, it was about a block, and on one occasion, I remember a van literally pulled up beside me. A bunch of guys opened the door and they're like, "Hey, you want to get in?" And I just run, right? And like that was and weird, and it was a weird thing. And I was like, I was young, so I didn't really I understood that was like, this is I got to get out of this. And then, and even Stacy tells stories of these guys going to parks and exposing themselves and stuff like that. And now you've just got a different sort of platform, so to speak, that's virtual to do that. And that's where kids are, they're spending most of their time online. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, that, I don't know how we square this particular circle, but just the other day, my youngest, who plays Roblox, is very good about saying, "Dad, somebody wants to friend me. Can I friend them?" And I'll go back through their chat and see what exactly has been discussed. And she'll show me their profile and stuff. So it's not detailed, but it's that kind of process where I can imagine some parents be like, "Why would I do that? Just if you want to do that, go ahead." But to the thing that you started talking about, it's not strangers who are committing the majority of these offenses. I can also see an argument in Roblox where they're not a stranger. I met them and I play with them. I don't know them, but I've talked to them a lot, and that's how so that's a bigger challenge. But you're right, that's not the majority of sexual offenses. It's a small proportion, and there are lots of other immediate concerns people should be focused on. But yeah, Roblox is just one of these niche areas for engagement.
Well, and there's so many other ones. I mean, I remember, originally, and again, this is going back in terms of time, in terms of the files, like I was talking about, that we've had over 25 years, and this is happening on Skype, right? And who uses? Not a lot of people. I don't know if Skype's a thing anymore. But and where randomly you'd get invitations to go onto Skype or something, and this is and then start chats, and then slowly see the grooming kind of behavior emerge that can take different forms, and some like blackmail, threatening and blackmail, and stuff like that. So sort of like how, there's a lot of really good research on sort of the grooming process of adults who commit child sexual offense against children, the tactics that they use to manipulate young kids and stuff like that, and often now you're seeing that happening just through chats, right, and things like that, and random connections and things, and so there's that element of it. But yeah, absolutely, a lot of these cases too, though, are like you said, they're people that are known, like they're known to each other, whether it's sadly, a sibling context, or immediate or extended family, and then sort of outwards to acquaintances and siblings of friends and things like that, and then yeah, definitely. So yeah.
So tell us more about what you actually do. What's your day-to-day like in terms of engaging with young people and the work at the clinic?
So yeah, because I'm the research director, it's kind of like a dream role in the sense that I don't have to deal with the administration of the clinic. That's Benoit, who Benoit Leclerc, and so he's the director right now. So he has to deal with the administration and the university side of things. I managed to snag this wonderful position where I just got to worry about getting grants and writing pubs. So it's like, oh, I've been waiting for this since my postdoc, right? Like my postdoc were the most glorious 3 years of my life. Like I had nothing to do but write and do whatever I want. It was fabulous. Now that's not necessarily the case right now, but yeah, so I'm kind of just in charge of the research side. So we have the directors, Benoit, myself as the research director, because we want to kind of start getting more research out of the clinic, like the things we're talking about today. And we have a clinical manager, and then there's sort of the service side of the clinic, right? So we have I think right now we have 5 or 6 clinicians. And so what makes the service actually quite unique is that we don't see kids at the service. Our clinicians will travel all over the state to their clients. And so I think our clinicians probably have about, on average, like moving around 4 to 5 or 6 clients each at any given time. So in 25 years, we've had, we just last year received our 1,000th referral, right? So just to give you a picture of context of the issue, 1,000 referrals in 25 years. And so we'll get referrals for different things. Some of them, so for example, oftentimes we'll get all of our referrals come from the Department of Youth Justice. Oftentimes they're for like just for pre-sentence reports and things. And then other times they'll be sentenced for treatment and things like that. And so of those 1,000, we've treated around half. So half have been referred for treatment. So that's 500 kids in 25 years. Now, I actually we just finished a study since I got back into this role. I wanted to do as rigorous an evaluation of the clinic as possible. And it's always been tricky, and other people have tried. We have different sort of evaluations that have come out, but the base rate of particularly of sexual reoffending is so low, especially among young people, that getting numbers to do sort of any kind of comparison is difficult. But when I came back, we have 25 years now. So I literally went to the Department of Youth Justice and I said, hey, look, can you guys give me all the data on all of the young people in the state who have committed a sexual offense in the last 25 years? And then in that obviously would be our 500 kids, right? And they're like, yeah, no problem. I was like, wow, that's fantastic. I don't know what to say. And so they did. And so we did we did a quasi experimental design with different sort of, we used propensity score matching, but we used a lot of different sort of methods to try and, create as robust a methodology as possible, looking at the outcomes of our clients versus the kids that weren't referred. And so the issue around referrals, so our clinic obviously has quite limited capacity. So oftentimes it's not that referrals will often get turned away for a capacity, right? So we're able theoretically at least to do some really precise matching. in fact, we were able to match kids at gifts for the specific offense they're referred for to kids who weren't, because there's so many. So because this was our matching pool was 2,299 other kids.
That's
So
bonkers for an offending
yeah,
sample.
yeah, like 25 years, right? So because we're talking about, I remember coming in 2010 when I got to gifts, and Stephen was like, we got to do an evaluation, but just the numbers weren't there, right? And so finally we've been able to do it, and the results are really positive. So we were able to show, because the base rates were high enough, we were able to show that kids who came out of gifts, who had gifts treatment, were like 90% less likely to reoffend than kids who didn't have it. Sexually, for general offending was like 40 to 50%. So really positive kind of evidence of for that. So, and part of it, so the service is unique insofar as like, it provides specialized treatment for kids. So like some of our clinicians have seen clients sometimes for 2.5 years. And we were able to control for all that and periods of time in custody and everything. Like it just came out this year. It's in Journal of Criminal Justice, and so yeah, so we were able to control for all that. But the model is quite unique in the sense that it's it's multi-systemic therapy, it's cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's more that it's tailored to each specific kid. And our clinicians typically spend a lot of time with these kids, months, at minimum usually. And they go to them. And so, and obviously, like, again, in Canada and in the US, you have an overrepresentation of different groups and that. So in Australia, we have an overrepresentation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander young people. So it's about like 30 or 40%. And so our clinicians actually go to their community. So, and in Australia, there's a lot of quite remote communities because it's geographically so big. And these are communities. In some of these communities, you don't have running water. Like it's we call that fourth world kind of poverty, right? Where in a developed country you have sort of these conditions. And so we see a lot of, and our clinicians actually go to these communities to deliver treatment that's actually culturally appropriate too. And when you're in these communities, something like MST, multisystemic therapy, isn't about necessarily sort of mom and dad, but it's about it's consistent with the cultural structure that are in those communities, right? And whoever might be there as a positive stakeholder for the young person. And so, I mean, so this is sort of the model of the clinic that's also kind of rooted in understanding behavior from a developmental life course point of view. So like we don't have kids come into like an office with fluorescent lights and all that kind of stuff. And that's by design. So it's and I think it is, at least in Australia, it's unique in that sense. But yeah, so that's sort of how the clinic operates. The research has been kind of on the side since it started. And now we have obviously a lot more data to be doing that. So part of what we wanted to do, and Benoit and I stepped into these roles, was to say, yeah, let's get now that we have all this data and it's been 25 years, we can start doing some pretty important stuff, I think. So yeah.
That's great. I mean, the cultural appropriateness in particular, I think, is so important, especially for youth, right? Because you want interventions to align with their structure. And I think that's so often a challenge.
Yeah, it's not, it definitely is. And you can't, the thing that I've learned is that in this role, and it was actually from a PhD dissertation I reviewed years ago that was looking at the problem of sexual assault and sexual abuse in Indigenous communities. And the one thing that I learned from that thesis was that, which was done by an Indigenous person, was that, it's easy to forget, but there are very important cultural differences specifically around the things we're talking about, specifically around like sexual norms and mores. And like, let's be fair, like in Western culture, like it's a very taboo, private kind of thing. Like we don't talk about sexuality, we don't talk about sex. My wife was presenting a paper at a medical conference in the U.S. about something to do with child sexual development, and a couple of the participants who were there were basically stood up and were like, "Can't believe you're talking about this disgusting blah blah blah," and you're like it's like kids start developing sexually at 13. That's not how it works, so because this is part of a study in Vancouver she was involved in. But to my point, very taboo, we're very private. The cultural norms and mores around sexuality are very different in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders cultures in Australia, and they're different in Europe, right? In different European cultures. So, and that plays a role when you have it's a Western colonized country, and what we're doing in terms of sort of going into communities charging like a sexual offense is a sexual offense, but not understanding that context can be really detrimental to what happens after that, right? To what happens after that offense is committed and how it's dealt with, particularly in Indigenous communities. And again, that's one of the things that we've always had a couple of clinicians. We've had clinicians obviously come and go over 25 years. But that specialize in sort of going into those communities and spending time with the community members and things like that. So yeah.
I could ask so many more questions about that approach and how you all go about it, but I think it's great work. And so to wrap up our conversation today, we typically ask our guests, what's the takeaway here for maybe the average person about, we talked about a lot of different things, but juvenile sexual offending and sexual offending against children, what should the average person know about these?
Oh, geez.
That's the typical response at first.
Yeah, you said we're wrapping up. How much time do we have? Geez. Look, I think on the one hand, whether we're talking about sort of the tech side of this or not, I think, it's important, I think, that parents need to spend time understanding how their kids are engaging with technology, maybe more than they do, and challenge themselves to understand it, I think, which is, tricky. I think, to me, I think that would be the biggest takeaway message. And I think tying into sort of the broader kind of discussion would be, understanding more broadly, like what your kids are doing, who they're hanging out with. And that, those two are related, right? And so whether that's online or offline, understanding, who your children's friends are and things like that, can go probably a long way to preventing, some of these kind of really, again, the base rate of the things we're talking about is not high, right? It just gets a lot of attention because of the impacts and the harm that's caused. And that's not to downplay it, but it's at all. But I think it's important to understand too that those things aren't as common, I think, as they're made out to be. But at the same time, I think parents need to be vigilant around what their kids are doing, whether it's online or offline, and who they're doing it with. I think so. I think that might be my takeaway. So.
And it sounds like treatment is extremely important. It's not a catch-all, but it does make a big difference, particularly based on the results of your evaluation.
Yeah, I think so. I think when it comes to the treatment side of things, especially, look, it's one of the things, like you said, when we got into this, why did you get into the research, was this idea that there was this homogenous kind of offender when you talked about sex offenders. And it's very clear now that there's a lot of heterogeneity in this population, whether it's young people or adults. Now, and then going to your point though, having said that if we understand that means that you can't just have like, okay, we're just going to do CBT with everybody or relapse prevention and stuff. Like there's some, yes, that might work if it's a pattern of, sexual behavior that's that's maladaptive that needs to be corrected or whatever, then that's appropriate. But if that's not the case, which it's often not, then it's not. So you have CBT clinics that are a group. So the point I'm making is that look, it costs a lot of money, like a lot of money. We're actually we're trying to get a cost benefit analysis going pretty quick, but it costs a lot of money. But everybody who we're talking about, each individual, they've gotten there a different way for different reasons, and there's some similarities. But it's that idea of individualized treatment. You have to tailor treatment. It's risk, needs, responsivity, right? Like, I mean, you need to, and that's part of the basis for the model of the clinic as well. And so it's applying it at the individual level. I think that's when you see it. But again, it's difficult. It's it's hugely expensive too, right? So you have to kind of find ways to sell it, and hopefully that's what we can do. So.
Well, this is great. Yeah, I feel like we could definitely talk a lot longer about a lot of different topics. So we'll have to have you back on because this was really interesting. Thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. No, this is great. As you can see, it's starting to be light. So I'm all ready to do research now. This actually worked out really well. My brain is kind of going, So.
Perfect.
A little warm up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for joining us, and thanks everybody for joining us on this episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you the next time we cross the firewall. Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.